tailor products to suit the individual customers and not to just box everybody together. UMB, I'm happy for you, and I pray the Lord who has brought you this far, will even bring you to higher levels. I first met UMB when I was at the crossroads of my business. I had a serious problem, and UMB has made it possible for me to still stand today. How did they do this? They did not work and put me in a box. They looked at me as an individual and got a product for me which helped me to survive the period. And I'm happy that they are still here, and I understand why they are here. Banks should look at it and see how they can also go that way to be able to meet individual customers, tailor products to suit the individual customers, and not to just box everybody together. UMB, I'm happy for you, and I pray
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to tonight's program. Shall we please stand as we welcome the speaker and the chair? And while they walk in, kindly put your phones on silent.
Please kindly resume your seat, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. The President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, vice presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, the Honorable Herbert Krapper, Deputy Minister for Trade and Industry, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Ghana's premier learned society, I warmly welcome you all to day 2 of this year's 3-day public forum. The Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences Public Forum, which usually takes place in June every year, started as a collaboration with the Frederick Ebert Foundation in 1993. The maiden event was on the theme, Making Democracy Work in the Fourth Republic. 2 decades thereafter, in 2013, the Public Forum became exclusively a Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences event. Over the years, the Public Forum has dealt with themes such as accountability in governance, genetically modified organisms, waste management, migration and development, and sustainable development goals and national development. This year's theme is the African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. That the topic is an important one goes without saying, in view of the economic circumstances in which Africa finds itself at the moment. And I have no doubt that the experts invited to speak on various sub-themes, who will be introduced to you shortly, will do justice to their topics and make your time here with us worthwhile. As I indicated yesterday, this year we are delighted to announce that we have support from UMB Bank, which is celebrating its 50th year and is collaborating with us to organize this all-important event. We thank them for their support. Let me at this point invite Madame Belinda Buama, Executive Director, Strategy, UMB Bank, to say a few.
Thank you. The President, Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Vice Presidents of the Academy, Fellows of the Academy, colleague bankers, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. A very good evening to you all. Let me first welcome you all to the 2022 edition of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences Public Forum Lecture Series. Ever since these lecture series were instituted, the topics selected have been driven by topical issues in society and designed to bridge the gap between the Academy and the general public through joint deliberations. Over the years, such deliberations have yielded positive outcomes. The 2021 edition focused on vaccines, and I'm sure that coming right on the heels of the pandemic, the issues discussed were centered on policy issues that will have been pursued to ensure production of vaccines on the continent towards such future pandemics. The 2022 edition of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences Public Lecture Series is being organized under the broad theme, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. The theme, in my view, has been appropriately selected to reflect the circumstances of the times in which we find ourselves. In a post-COVID environment, we see efforts being made by advanced and emerging market economies to resuscitate their economies. The same goes for the countries on the African continent who are struggling to put in place growth packages to bring their economies back to life. As we all know, after seeks, among others, to create larger market access for countries in the region, to boost intra-regional trade, to grow manufacturing activities, to increase investment and economic growth, to create jobs and help reduce poverty on the continent, among others. All these will have to take place in a sound and stable macroeconomic environment, and UMB is committed to these objectives. We are therefore positioning our operations and working closely with key economic operators to take advantage of the benefits that AfCFTA comes along with. The Universal Merchant Bank is proud to sponsor the Academy's Forum this year as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. UMB was established as a policy bank in 1972 with the aim of providing the Ghanaian state with an indigenous capacity for merchant banking. 50 years on, our scope has expanded, but our focus remains the same. And doing all we can to ensure that the Ghanaian economy becomes the best in Africa and beyond. Our expectations from this lecture series is to derive policy lessons that will enable us to refocus on our operations in support of SMEs and corporate customers, so as to allow them to take maximum advantage of the ideals of AfCFTA. Still putting in place the right infrastructure that will allow SME and corporate clients leverage on for smoother business operations in the sub-region and beyond. We are hopeful that these deliberations today will delve deep into critical issues that are supportive of building the critical masses of businesses. We are of the firm conviction that our association with this forum will yield positive dividends for UMB, and as such, we take this event seriously. I will conclude by once more expressing how deeply honored we are to be part of this program, to say a big thank you for coming tonight, and to urge you all to please come to UMB so that we can serve you and make available to you the UMB advantage. That advantage that has continued to provide a uniquely Ghanaian perspective to banking since 1972. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda Boama, Executive Director, Strategy, UMB Bank. I'd like to acknowledge the Honorable Herbert Krapper, Deputy Minister for Trade and Industry, who has just joined us. Welcome. Now, it is my singular honor to introduce to you the chairperson for this evening's event. She is in the person of Emerita Professor Isabella Kwachi, Vice President for the Sciences section of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Kwachi is a professor of immunology and parasitology at the University of Ghana. The first Emerita Professor in the Sciences at the University of Ghana, Professor Kwachi established the immunology unit at the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research from 1980 to 1983. She was the first female director of the University of Ghana School of Public Health and the foundation dean of the school. So she went from director to dean, also making her the first female dean in the College of Health Sciences at the University of Ghana. She served from 2002 to 2007 in that capacity. She has served on numerous national and international committees and boards and received several awards. She is a former member of Ghana Health Service Council and former UNESCO Chair for Women in Science and Technology in the West Africa region. Professor Kwachi won the 2014 Laureate African Union Kwame Nkrumah Award for Women in Science. She is the 2019 laureate for the Clara Southmead Ludlow Award by the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Women's World Day 2021 recognized her as one of 7 women in science who have changed our world for the better. In addition to being a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Emerita Professor Kwachi is a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Please welcome Emerita Professor Kwachi, our chairperson, with a round of applause.
Thank you, Honorary Secretary, for the elaborate introduction. President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, vice presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, Honorable Herbert Krapper, Deputy Minister for Trade and Industry, CEO of UMB, Madame Belinda Boama, Executive Director, Strategy, UMB, distinguished guests, in person and virtual, our students, all protocols observed, good evening. Today is day 2 of our public forum, and we promised you an exciting menu. Just want to remind you the main theme of our forum, African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. Day 1, we had our sub-theme, Economic Structure and Inter-Africa Trade. Today, day 2, Our sub-theme is Political Economy of African Trade. We have two exciting topics and two exciting speakers. And our first speaker for topic A which is Political Legal Environments for the AFCFTA, and I'll introduce each speaker before they speak. And so our first speaker is Professor Ernest Kofi Abochi. Professor Ernest Kofi Abochi is the Dean of the UPSA Law School and an Associate Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law and International Law. Prior to his appointment, he was the immediate past Dean of the Gimpa Law School, a position he held for 6 years. Dean Abochi is a practicing lawyer and public intellectual, a member of the Ghanaian Bar, and also the chairman of the Ghana Forum of the Africa Bar Association, a group comprising practicing lawyers from across Africa. Dean Abochi holds a Bachelor of Laws degree and Barrister at Law certificate from the University of Ghana and the Ghana School of Law, respectively, as well as a Master of Laws degree from the Harvard Law School in the United States. His terminal degree in law, namely a doctoral degree, is in European Constitutional Law and International Law from the University of Milan, Italy. He is widely consulted and has been a visiting scholar and guest lecturer in leading European and American universities, including Oxford University, Fordham Law School, Indiana Law School, and the University of Milan, Bicocca. He has served on constitutional commissions and advised on reforms of the 1992 Ghanaian Constitution, as well as the structural reforms of key ministries and agencies of state. In addition to the above, Dean Abochi has served on a number of boards and advisory councils and played pivotal roles in shaping the policy directions of corporate entities in Ghana, including currently being the chairman of the advisory board of the Chief Executives Network of Ghana, a body comprising the CEOs of some of the largest and notable corporations in Ghana. He has written extensively in leading peer-reviewed journals of law in the world, and his current research focuses on the institutional implications of supranationality under ECOWAS and the work of the ECOWAS Court of Justice. In the field of legal practice, he is a lawyer of 20 years of standing at the bar. And during his years of practice, he accumulated experiences in litigation, transactional practice, and represented the interests of clients in numerous fields of practice, including corporate restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, corporate financing, legal assets management, securities and share dealings, among others. He is an honorary fellow of the Institute of Directors and a member of the Ghana Bar Association and Rotary International. Audience, your speaker, Professor Abochi.
Professor Chair, Honorable Minister of Trade, my good friend, other distinguished personalities. I think these days it's hard to identify anyone because of the mask. So I'll just say all protocols observed. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy that we have a lot of young people in the room today, because the Africa of old was an Africa of governments. The new Africa is an Africa of people. And the single dominant group in Africa are young people. It is therefore no coincidence, I'm sure, that the largest number of people who are gathered here tonight are actually the future of Africa. It speaks volumes of what we are about to speak about, which is the Africa Trade Deal. the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This agreement would work because of young people. This agreement would work because of people, because of entities. A lot of the reasons why Africa may not have succeeded in implementing what some would consider lofty projects of old have been due to the fact that these projects were left to governments. And African governments have not demonstrated themselves, at least from past experience, to have had both the commitment and in some cases the wherewithal to follow through with agreements. Therefore, it's imperative and it's heartwarming for us to know that we have today in this room the largest concentration of people who belong to the future. And that explains my opinion, respectfully, Madam Chair, why the AFCFTA would work. With that, I'll start by saying when the AFCFTA came into force in 2019, many celebrated the dawn of what is considered perhaps the biggest commercial agreement in Africa's history. If the agreement is significant for its effect in creating the single largest free trade area on the continent, it is all the more remarkable in the sheer opportunity it affords the continent that is arguably endowed among the lot. Viewed from a multiplicity of angles, the AFCFTA presents an opportunity for Africa to reset its relationship with itself and the outside world and leverage on the enormous commercial advantages offered by the deal to overcome any challenges confronting the continent. From exploitative bilateral trade deals to geopolitical uncertainty impacting the fortunes of the continent, Africa has had a short end of the stick always. For some, the rigged rules of international trade in favor of the most powerful players of the world, pandemics and their impact on multilateralism, and the general retreat of globalism and globalization in general implies that a new paradigm and dynamic is called for, in which Africa and Africans chart an agenda that reflects the progress and prosperity hoped for the millions of Africans. The recognition of the need to institute an instrumental mechanism in the form of a major policy intervention came with the AU's adoption of what has been called Agenda 63. That policy blueprint contains the framework prescription for Africa's development, and the sunset provision of 2063 represents the 50-year multi-layered ambition of the continent. Yet the statement of lofty ideals not backed by any concrete plan to help ensure their attainment, some will argue, has been the lot of the continent, as I mentioned. The adoption of the AFCFTA, therefore, represents a fundamental yet refreshing departure from that tendency. But like all deals embodying the interest of over 50 different countries against the background of the weight of other external factors or interests, the AFCFTA is bound to encounter pressures and challenges in respect of which it has to deal or counter. That trade is the major lever of contemporary economic development is a truism that requires little need of proof. The increasing globalization of countries in the world, which has led to the increased prosperity of people, have been largely spurred on by trade. China stands as a visible testament to that reality. In our time, we have witnessed how one country has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of desperate poverty within a single generation. Now note, that did not happen until China's admission to the WTO in 2001. Africa has something to learn from China's experience with trade, and it would seem that the continent's policy on this reflects a new approach to commerce in its overall policy architecture. Viewed simply, the AFCFTA establishes the single largest trade area by numbers and size. The IMF describes the AFCFTA as a game changer, perhaps in recognition of the sheer potential offered by the AFCFTA and the relatively greater devotion of resources and commitment to this project compared to others, including NEPAD. Let's look at a few numbers. Africa has a population of 1.2, 1.3 billion, depending on what estimate you believe. The combined GDP of Africa is 3 trillion. Africa has 4 of the 10 largest growing economies in the world. Africa has the youngest population. For a continent the size of Africa and all the prospects of the continent, Africa has only 3% of global trade, and this clearly represents an anomaly. Yet a mixed bag of structurally weak economies and geopolitical obstacles have meant that African countries have and will remain in the doldrums of global trade unless something drastic is done. Prof. Chair, the AFCFTA appears to be that something that the IMF was speaking about. If the IMF's conception is anything to go by, then the inception of the AFCFTA must certainly reflect renewed energy and happiness on the continent. The basic agenda of the AFCFTA is to establish a single continental market undergirded by the removal of tariffs and other structural barriers to trade. The trade deal contained under the AFCFTA represents perhaps the boldest attempt at institutionalizing free trade on the continent. The enormity of the opportunities presented under the AFCFTA can simply not be overemphasized. The statistics earlier shared confirmed the untapped potential of the continent and its shared developmental prospects when these are exploited for the benefit of the African people. The youthful population of the continent presents an opportunity for a growing consumer population who will lead the growth of its economies and inspire the production and consumption of goods and services. The current world economy testifies to this. When young people with an ever-active and nearly insatiable appetite for the fine things of life have championed innovations and productivity, this have always come to represent development. Capped with a burgeoning population density of 1.3 billion, which is projected to grow, Africa presents a continent with a ready market for its goods when produced, services when needed and available, and a hungry market in need of satisfaction. Given the fact that it has the largest concentration of minerals and any raw materials deposits in the world, in general terms, coupled with the growing skilled labor of its population, the continent has a potential like no other. Harnessing this towards beneficial ends requires the pooling of resources and opportunities together and benefiting from the economies of scale presented in integration. Dismantling trade borders and enabling reciprocal access to markets through trade has been an imperative for decades now. Some will even argue that the AFCFTA has been late in coming and perhaps should have been adopted decades ago. That argument has some attraction to it, but I'm not attracted equally. Neither will I devote much time to it because it is futile in the circumstances. It's already here. Moving forward, an opportunity that enables the removal of pointless restrictions in the character of tariffs. I will revisit this again, but for now, let me say that for a continent that suffers so much poverty, it remains counterintuitive and mind-boggling that it is the least traded among itself, hovering around the 16th percentile mark when the global average is above the 50th percentile mark. Intracontinental trade is important for several reasons. First, apart from reducing transaction costs of crossing distances overseas, actors in intracontinental trading can leverage on the similarity of cultural patterns and greater knowledge of given terrains. For after all, trade is a subsect of life. The model adopted by the AFCFTA is instructive, and this is informed by the African situation. Given that many African countries are structurally dependent on taxes and levies at the port, the removal of taxes has been seen as pernicious to the overall benefit of countries on the continent. In fact, this explains why many countries, including Nigeria, were quite late in signing the agreement. The truth of the matter, however, is that while this may hold true for import-dependent countries, it is not exactly accurate, given that the net effect of paying tariffs at the borders of other countries when exporting knocks off whatever benefits countries derive when they impose taxes on others when importing. Beyond this, the psyche of mutually imposing taxes on goods originating from the continent creates a race to the bottom mentality, which in the end weakens all economies involved. On the other hand of the spectrum, rather bizarrely, countries on the continent have often entered into bilateral and in some cases multilateral arrangements with countries and regions outside the continent, some of which have had the effect of removing and forgiving tariffs of these countries altogether. Many people will remember Ghana's experience, and indeed West Africa's experience with the EU not too long ago. When considered from the standpoint of the fact that the relationship between the concerned African countries and these other countries is often one in which African countries are net importers of the goods of the foreign countries, the relationship becomes in reality predatory relative to other African countries who have come to compete with goods from these European countries while paying high tariffs among each other. Clearly, a trading regime predicated on the removal of barriers holds the potential to unleash the dormant but creative potential of the people of Africa. When new markets are created, the ensuing opportunities that follow engender talents and efforts, and a whole new industry is spawned. The AFCFTA holds that potential, and the signs are already beginning to show with growth in cross-border businesses across the continent. This lecture requires that I reflect on the challenges that will likely beset the new regime. Discussing challenges to a new system like the AFCFTA may come across as a cliché to some, but I will argue that there are real bolts and nuts obstacles that need to be dealt with in the trading regime under the AFCFTA for purposes of the future. It is on this basis, therefore, that I spend more time in this lecture discussing the problem more than the potential, because I understand there was a discussion has gone before mine, and I'm very confident that the prospects and benefits have been mentioned, but I'm to look at the challenges and prospects, mainly focusing on challenges in this case. Now, implementing the AFCFTA at full throttle will require that fundamental bolts and nuts of the agreement be reviewed and repositioned. Crucially, there are significant political economy hurdles that can confront the optimal implementation of the agreement and the full realization of the gains or benefits of the regime. A critical issue that had to be tackled without further delay for future success of the regime is the need for the removal of all barriers impeding free movement of goods, services, and persons. What I am calling for here is the free movement of persons across the borders through the institution of visa-free travels. Having undergone a process of cross-continental decolonization for over 50 years, African countries have no business maintaining and enforcing colonial boundaries erected to preserve the interest of colonial powers in the wake of European imperialism. The requirement of visas for travel to various African countries is simply unsustainable for the growth of the trading regime. If continental entrepreneurs are expected to move from embassy to embassy in search of visas anytime they have to travel to visit their businesses, then the risk and uncertainty of not getting visas when applied for can be expected to be sufficient disincentive to deter businesses from investing and doing business across the continent. The free movement of persons is materially important to the continental integration of economies and business interests. Travel restrictions beyond visas in the character of other border entry requirements, including COVID restrictions, have come to dominate international travel, and many countries on the continent are cashing in and heightening the obstacles to entry. No trading regime can succeed in the midst of barriers put in the way of movement across the trading zone. Removing visa requirements is, however, only the first step in easing movement for trading purposes. Countries on the continent continue to experience many non-structural barriers put in the way of travelers entering them. Some countries have actually gone as far as to remove visa requirements, but they've instituted what they call tourist levies. And I just returned recently from an African country, and there's no requirement for visas. It is a West African country. There is no requirement for visas. However, there was a requirement to pay hundreds of euros for tourist levy. That is another visa levy, given a new name. In the absence of true commitment, you simply cannot succeed in the arrangement instituted under the AFCFTA. Corruption is another problem. Corruption remains a major obstacle, and the inception of the pandemic offers further opportunity for corrupt officials to further their goals. When traders are asked to make illicit payments or be excluded, this tends to heighten the transaction cost of doing business, and this acts as a disincentive towards commencing and sustaining businesses across the continent. On the other hand, free movement unhindered by visas and other restrictions promotes and facilitates trade by enabling easy exchange while ensuring that supply chain dynamics are not affected or obstructed. While there are plans underway to adopt appropriate protocols in the future, I'm aware of, I think the AU and the AFCFTA Secretariat could speed up the process. Perhaps the Secretariat could circumvent the complex and slow-paced process at the multilateral level by starting a voluntary free movement area under which countries of the AFCFTA could be encouraged to voluntarily sign up and allow on a reciprocal basis. Visa-free travel has existed among a few countries of the continent. And Ghana and Kenya, for example, have had that. Ghana and Rwanda have that relationship. Ghana and Singapore, which is a country outside the continent. Ghana and a few countries have visa-free relationships. I do not think this is difficult to have an arrangement in which countries on the continent basically voluntarily agree that we constitute a certain group, and if you want to join us, you join us, and by joining us, any holder of your passport can travel to any member of that group. I'm sure with that, the race to the bottom will actually be converted into a race to the top, where every country would want to be a part of that and not want to be excluded from the facilitation that is afforded by the free movement of goods and services allowed in that respect. The resultant economies of scale ensuing from the free movement of goods and persons and services is likely to encourage others to join, and this will ultimately lead to a faster adoption of a continent-wide visa-free travel regime and a complete removal of all obstacles or restrictions on travel, especially relative to trade and commerce. Another actual and potential challenge that may confront the nascent development of trade under the AFCFTA is the subject of structurally similar character of African economies and how this could impede trade. The economic reality is that African countries have been identified as being largely producers of primary commodities. Trade fundamentally survives on exchange, and products fundamentally survives on exchange of goods, services, and other products. And this is materially important or critical as an oxygen to the regime. Unless, therefore, any prevalent market is diversified, players are likely to look elsewhere for other markets. Deliberately building a dynamic market that reflects the needs and capabilities of the various countries on the continent cannot be overemphasized. Creating centers of excellence, for example, for various products and service variables can be an excellent means of promoting market diversification and overcoming the deficit in value addition or value-added production on the continent. Building or intensifying an integrated market could also require that we install supporting systemic infrastructure, including roads, telecommunication networks, intra-regional air traffic, customs and border processing systems, and so on across the continent. The state of trade facilitation and support is an important determinant of the success of the regime. The agility and dynamics of the market within the continent will be crucial to the endurance of the market and the establishment of supporting structures and diversity in the AFCFTA zone is indispensable. The fact that many countries on the continent produce the same thing, and the fact that very often that same thing are raw materials that are extracted from nature, beyond which there's very little value addition, implies that we are hardly likely to need things that we produce ourselves. And we are all likely to be interested in some other finished products produced in other markets. For what will shape the AFCFTA is not a state of interest or treaty commitment to the regime by the economic forces of demand. For what is likely to shape the interest in the AFCFTA is likely to be the economic forces of demand and supply, and this demand is often driven by commercial, not political interest. And so even though political interest will be materially important, given the fact that you need that space, that congenial environment for market players to play, it is imperative that the AFCFTA Secretariat and indeed governments pay attention to creating that necessary attractive commercial variable. And that commercial variable has to do with what players want, what traders want, what the supply chain dynamic reflects and needs. Countries who are all structurally primary commodity dependent are unlikely to demand each other's products, as the capacity to transform those products into finished goods or value-added materials is limited. Building their capacities in manufacturing is therefore a basic unavoidable necessity. In the minimum, supply chain dynamics cannot be viable and sustainable if they are not interested players and buyers and sellers of the primary goods and secondary products that are being produced. Another problematic challenge that needs addressing is the role of bilateral investment treaties and or bilateral trade agreements. These agreements create specific trade and investment obligations between parties thereto, and for the purposes of the AFCFTA, these impact the preferential treatment that affected states are supposed to give to members of the trading regime. While the AFCFTA Secretariat cannot legally stop member states from adopting other agreements that are not facially incompatible with the AFCFTA, it can adopt a policy on these. Perhaps a useful model would be for the AFCFTA to adopt an approach which discourages these bilateral agreements by directing that no such agreement should grant preferences which are over and above beyond those granted under the AFCFTA to foreign entities. In other words, if you're an AFCFTA member, you should have no right to enter into either a bilateral or multilateral trading regime with countries outside of Africa that grants preferential treatment to those countries over and above those that are granted under the AFCFTA. The converse would simply make nonsense of the entire AFCFTA arrangement. In addition, the rules of origin need to be stringently enforced if BITs or bilateral investment treaties or bilateral trade agreements are not to be essentially rendered otious. The converse will be that the bilateral trade agreement can become a strategic means for non-African countries to evade the preferential treatment of the zone by simply entering into agreement with these countries and basically flooding African markets using these third country conduits. A core challenge that could potentially undermine the optimal enforcement of the AFCFTA arrangement also is the issue of remedies for breaches of the rights of members or non-members, for breaches of the rights of members by another member of the AFCFTA. Among others, the Dispute Settlement Board, which is the main, more or less, judicial body tasked to settle disputes under the AFCFTA, is empowered to order retaliatory measures to be undertaken by the injured members against offending members. The success of retaliatory members as a remedy in trade law, however, depends on two fundamental factors. First, proportionality. The second, that the containment of any such measure from escalation be carefully monitored. The degree to which the Dispute Settlement Board is able to moderate the management of such retaliatory measures will determine the effectiveness of that measure as a whole. Proportionality clearly just deals with the fact that a particular measure must meet in equal terms with the measure against which it's supposed to respond. In terms of proper containment, containment is designed to ensure that a retaliatory measure, which in many ways is a vengeance measure, so to speak, in simple language, does not get out of hand, and that the essence of the retaliation is clearly moderated, so that we don't move from retaliation to a complete escalation that basically cannot be contained within the context of the trade settlement process. Admittedly, retaliatory measures can be an effective counterweight to any breaches by any member state, as they remove any incentive towards misbehavior by member states and intent on breaching or offending the rules of trade. As indicated, however, the Secretariat must move to eliminate the prospect of an opportunistic application of the measure when activating, by ensuring that when taken, retaliatory measures are superintended by the rule and under the aegis of the Secretariat or the DSB. A key weakness of the regime that needs to be attenuated is the effect and the role of the state in the whole AFCFTA regime. A cursory look at the framework would seem to suggest that the AFCFTA is a state-centric arrangement, and that this, for example, is reflected in the question of standing in dispute settlement. Prof. Chair, when clearly individuals and actors and businesses are the objects of the AFCFTA, these actors cannot bring claims before the DSB or the Dispute Settlement Board in the event of a complaint, but they must channel their complaints through their respective states or governments. Ordinarily, this should not be a problem in an ideal African world in which the state was both efficient and optimally serves the interests of its citizens equally. In the real African situation, however, the reality is different, and the current model could frustrate the interest of potential litigants or complainants under the AFCFTA, who may simply have to endure the frustration or be abandon their claims when the state pursuer shows no interest in pursuing its interest or pushing its interest through whenever they bring such complaints to the attention of their state. In other words, under the current regime, if a business, so you have business A exporting from country A to business B in country B, and there's a dispute between business A and business B, business A cannot come before the Dispute Settlement Board in Accra and start proceedings, or cannot go before the AFCFT Secretariat and start proceedings. Business A has to go through its government, and the business A's government will then also go through the AFCFTA and get in touch with business B in the state B. You know, the whole thing can get a bit complicated. And if care is not taken, particularly when states are not really interested, sometimes not interested, but they simply have a lot on their plate themselves. The states are also bothered about all kinds of daily issues of governance. And so rather than going to chase after the commercial interest of a particular company, that may not really be the priority of a particular government. That could become problematic, and it does seem that perhaps this aspect of the arrangement may not have been properly carefully reflected on in the adoption process. While it may appear that these individual business actors may have the path or window of opportunity opened under the process called arbitration, it is quite silent in terms of the extent to which individuals can even exploit that process. Indeed, an overall reading of the rules would suggest that perhaps the standing restrictions placed on individuals on accessing the DSB for purposes of establishing panels, should they want to pursue the path of arbitration, is itself a bit muddy. It is suggested that while the Secretariat may seek to clarify the question of standing in general, especially relative to arbitration, a preferable reading of the clause will be one which allows an individual to access the facilitation of the DSB for purposes of seeking settlement under the arbitral options. Not only will these be in keeping with the overall underlying philosophy of the agreement, it will also empower disputing parties to seize control of the process through the alternative process of arbitration, but will also further enable a greater management of the process by the parties for whose interests and in whose name the regime has been set up in the first place. The legal implications of the AFCFTA, however, go beyond the dispute settlement mechanism of the agreement to the need to deploy ancillary substructural and substantive legal regimes that support the system. Among these are rules on competition, standards, including sanitary and phytosanitary schemes and regimes, supporting environmental regulations, including sustainable harvesting and value chain rules, among others. These supporting laws and infrastructure shape the direction of the regime and ensures equal compliance with the rules of the AFCFTA. More importantly, they ensure that in the end, the degree and the extent of market integration is deepened, and individual and differential country standards are harmonized. It is instructive that the AFCFTA regime has many of these in the pipeline, at least on paper for now, and some of them are actually in the process of development for full implementation. On the other hand, the reality remains that there exists a wide disparity in the capacities and competencies of the various member countries to the AFCFTA. While some may have attained moderate to beyond average competencies in these fields, Others have barely any capacity in these issues of technical competence. There will therefore be the need to engage in some preliminary capacity building of countries in need of these. For example, it may become necessary to build indicative lists like those of panels for persons and entities with capacity to train and provide expert representation or evidence when necessary for countries which may be in need of these as and when necessary, especially those going through litigation or trade dispute settlement. This may become necessary in order to equalize the opportunities presented by the trade deal, while ensuring that trade litigation is also not left to the behest of a few countries. It is instructive that the dispute settlement scheme established under the AFCFTA reflects the need for flexibility for a trade deal like the one adopted. It combines mainstream litigation through the panel and appeals board system with opportunities for consultation and diplomatic engagement. This dual remedial model recognizes the reality of the trade deal being a combination of political variables and legal dynamics, and accordingly, the need to balance the expectation of countries in this vein. Thus, while the countries are allowed the option of resorting to mainstream litigation by requesting the establishment of panels when a trade dispute arises between countries, or rather between entities, they are equally allowed the option of resorting to diplomatic engagements. Many have said that the trade dispute model adopted under the AFCFTA is similar to that of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. And as to whether this is a good thing, I will not comment on that for now. What is notable, however, is the fact that the AFCFTA model is underlain by 4 broad principles, namely the values or principles of fairness, accountability, transparency, and predictability. The extent to which this regime survives and thrives depends on the trust and confidence reposed in the dispute settlement system, and this in turn is further conditional on the system's adherence to these time-tested values. A system that is deemed fair, the dispute resolution system will inevitably exact the confidence of members who will in turn submit their dispute for resolution, expecting fairness and just outcomes in the end. Similarly, deemed transparent, and the system will engender confidence and respect, given the fact that nothing is hidden and that fears and anxieties of corruption, fears and anxieties of underhand dealing, and other fears and anxieties of partisanship have been removed. The prospects of all kinds of allegations and questions would have been dealt with and anticipated, and a fair process, a transparent process, can simply yield outcomes that are acceptable to all sides. Finally, in this respect, accountability will ensure that the actions of the officers and the organs of the judicial system are predicated on justifiable grounds and that these are not inspired by impunity. Any system of adjudication which is based on accountable mechanisms exacts not only confidence but also respect, and its own legitimacy is heightened. The dispute settlement process is properly anchored on values that are acceptable. The implementation of these is a real question. The AFCFTA represents an unprecedented step by African countries trying to change the commercial fortunes on the continent. Yet, like many agreements, it is set within the context of complex legal and political economy variables. Complex legal and political economy variables. The environment of its implementation require that these be recognized, properly seized, and dealt with if the agreement is to have any future success. Understanding the reality of subsystemic problems such as the free movement of persons and services, corruption, and differential country capacity in accessing the goodies offered by the agreement will be crucial to appreciating the effect of the dispute settlement system established under the agreement. For in the end, the DSB is a back-end product, and the feed into that back-end system needs to reflect a certain equity. For now, the proper thing for the AFCFTA, Secretariat in particular, to do is to clearly ensure that the good things on paper are reflected on the ground. I dare say that reality is not easy. It's not easy for a variety of reasons. There are still many countries that are skeptical of the AFCFTA arrangement. Some of these countries delayed in signing. Others have signed, but events immediately post-dating the signature of the AFCFTA raised more questions than answers. Some countries immediately they signed the agreement, they closed their borders, which is very interesting because you have just signed an agreement that basically says open your borders and then immediately you close your borders. There is one reality, and that reality is many African countries are skeptical and suspicious of each other. And these countries will view the AFCFTA arrangement as yet again an opportunity for big countries to consume the small ones. And it's imperative that we demonstrate that equality of implementation in terms of the agreement's benefits. But that equality of implementation itself cannot be equal, because once you demonstrate equality, the Secretariat will realize one thing, that the other countries that do not have the capacity, even when treated equally, actually lose out the most. And so that is where facilitation, and that is where some facilitative mechanisms will be put in place. It is on that basis that I actually called for the establishment of indicative units or technical capacity bodies that will actually bridge the differential capacities between the various countries, capacities on the basis of competition, capacities on the basis of technical proficiency, capacities on the basis of resources, and capacities simply on the basis of exposure. And it's important that the AFCFTA reflects these. I'm confident, and I have to say one thing, I'm very confident in the capacity of the AFCFTA Secretariat to achieve what many other agreements haven't achieved, as I indicated at the beginning of this lecture. And the reason I'm so confident has to do with the fact that unlike the past agreement, many of which beyond signatory or beyond these agreements being signed, did not see the fundamental bolt and nuts being put in place for their implementation, the AFCFTA appears to have departed in that respect. And the establishment of the Secretariat, the appointment of a very young Secretary General, the staffing of the Secretariat, the establishment of other sub-systemic entities, including financing houses across the continent, all these demonstrate a certain degree of readiness for the AFCFTA. And it's on that basis that I think that the political environment and the political economy environment for the AFCFTA is right. The legal environment is equally conducive, and the establishment of the DSB, which I indicated in my conclusion, is not only conducive, but could potentially work effectively, given that it is modeled along the lines of the WTO, which has had a time-tested implementation. And the AFCFTA appears actually to have learned from aspects of the WTO's ineffectiveness and have overcome these. So it adopted the WTO model, but appears to have improved on the WTO model. So I'm quite confident that the AFCFTA would work, and as I started, so shall I end. I think the fact that we have a lot of young people in this room today reflects the very future of Africa. The AFCFTA, unlike others, is not a government initiative, or it's not governments across Africa's initiative. The AFCFTA is people to people, business to business, and the African sub-state is truly alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Abuchi. That was extraordinary. Thank you. Another round of applause, please. And now we go to our second topic, which is the human rights implications of AFCFTA. And for this, we have Professor Kojo Appiagyei-Etua. Professor Kojo Appiagyei-Etua is an associate professor of the School of Law, University of Ghana, Legon, where he teaches public international law and international human rights law. He's also the representative lecturer from University of Ghana program in Human Rights and Democratization Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria, South Africa. Professor Appiagyei-Etua is a member of the Ghana Bar Association. He completed his LLB at University of Ghana and his professional law degree at the University of the Ghana School of Law. Thereafter, he proceeded to Dalhousie DCL programs, respectively. He was a Bank of Ireland postdoctoral research fellow at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, National University of Ireland. That's a mouthful. Professor Appiaje-Tuah recently completed his Marie Curie International Incoming Fellowship at the Center for Educational Research and Development, and this was at Lincoln University in UK, where he conducted research on building academic freedom and democracy in Africa. Prof has served as a consultant for various intergovernmental organizations and international civil society organizations such as United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, on its Education for Justice E4J initiative. Also the Open Society Foundation's Global Program on Drug Policy and Open Society Initiative for West Africa, OSIWA. He is member of the UN Working Group on Academic Freedom, formed as a follow-up to the release of the 2020 report on academic freedom by the then UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the rights of freedom of opinion and expression. He is also a board member of the Global Observatory on Academic Freedom from the Central European University, Vienna, Austria. He is an ambassador of the Magna Carta Observatory, University of Bologna, Italy, and a member of the Academic Freedom Committee of the International Studies Association, University of Connecticut, Stores, Connecticut, USA. His research interests are post-colonial analysis of the historiography of international law, human rights, and academic freedom. Audience, I give you Professor Appiaje-Tuah. Thank you.
President of the Academy, Vice Presidents of the Academy, Fellows of the Academy, Honorable Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, Executive Director, Strategy, UMB. Pleasure to be here to deliver this lecture, which seeks to analyze the relationship between free trade and human rights. And I'll do so from three angles. First, seeing human rights as a tool to promote free trade and development, and whether AFTA has been positioned to fulfill that goal. And then the impact of AFTA in two contexts, the benefits and the harms, and the human rights mix in that respect as well. To do so, I will do a visit to the past to lay the foundation for the review of the AFTA from the prism of human rights. When African states woke up to independence, the claim was that we only got the Euro-political independence, but we remained economically colonized. So African leaders had a quest to engage in rapid economic development for its citizenry and promising to catch up with the West within the shortest possible time. Having just come out of colonialism, it was justified to externalize the factors for Africa's chained economy by blaming the West, blaming colonialism for the woes of the continent, and even justifiable to go even further into slave trade and slavery, which was responsible for inserting Africa into the global economy as we have it today. So in terms of strategy, African leaders, among others, developing internally inward development to catch up with the West. And in this paradigm, human rights and democracy were seen as stumbling blocks to development. Human rights were seen as impossible luxuries that will fetter the attempt to realize this goal of rapid development. And it is only expected that when development is attained, that human rights will naturally begin to flourish for the citizenry. In other words, human rights will be a byproduct of development. And so, at this stage and time, it wasn't necessary to promote human rights. After a decade or more of such policy implementation, the much anticipated success story was not attained. World Bank, for example, in its 1980 report indicates, and I quote, on average, African people are as badly off at the time of the decade, that is the 1970s, as they were at the beginning. It continues, Sub-Saharan Africa has the most disturbing outlook of any region in the third world and may well be facing a decline in average incomes during the 80s. So the World Bank and Western states blamed Africa's problems on internal factors. That is, if you examine the modernization theory. On the other hand, African states blamed external factors or externalized Africa's problems. For example, the Lagos Plan of Action for the Economic Development of Africa. Between 1980 and 2000, it was supposed to be implemented. And the final act of Lagos said, among others, that the process of exploitation was inherited from the colonial period and continued through the past 2 decades and was carried out through neo-colonialist external forces which seek to influence the economic policies and directions of African states. Kwame Nkrumah is noted for having said that, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you. But what African leaders didn't realize that the political system was equally colonized. It was not just about flag independence that gave us or should give us political independence, but also dismantling some of the most repressive human rights structures that were left behind by colonialism, such as emergency powers, preventive detention acts, suppression of civil society activism, and so on. And so, at the time of independence, there wasn't just a discontinuity from colonial rule to post-colonial rule, but there were some continuities which were purposely designed to ensure that we remain colonized not only economically but also politically. But unfortunately, African leadership didn't consider that. And Ake was right in pointing that out, and he said, I quote, "The crisis is, to my mind, primarily a crisis of politics, from which the economic crisis derives. We do not see it as such because we have always regarded development as an autonomous process, not significantly mediated by cultural or political factors. Development always occurs in the context of a state system and a political leadership committed to development," unquote. So this is what Ake said, and which is supported by the presentation I make. But African leaders, as continually said, relied on the fact that human rights was not critical. So one of the framers of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Keba Mbeye, had this to say: "Thus, the African governments appear clearly to have sacrificed rights and freedoms for the sake of development and political stability. This situation can be explained and even justified. In mobilizing the masses in order to secure economic and social development, everyone's attention is directed exclusively towards the prospect of improved standards of living. In other words, as I said, you can attain development without human rights, and that is the way to go." The Lagos Plan of Action I already mentioned was a 140-page document. But in this document, there was only one reference to human rights, democracy, or rule of law. And that was in the context of considering women's rights, and it was captured as one of the reasons why many women shy away from enforcing their rights is fear of intricacies and expenses involved, unquote. So the economic morass that Africa found itself in the late 70s and 80s incidentally coincided with the worst form of human rights violations in Africa. You can talk about the Idi Amins, the Bokasas, the Yadimas, the Mobutus in our own backyard, the Rawlinses, the Gaddafis, the Nguemas, and so on. Around the same time, records indicate that corruption was on the rise. And Professor Bochi has alluded to that. Things didn't go well. We had to go to structural adjustment programs and other factors. But then the Lagos Plan of Action was not abandoned. It resulted in the treaty establishing the Economic African Community, which came into force in 1994 and changed the official name of the OAU, that's the Organization of African Unity, to the African Economic Community. The strategy or the framework to set up the African Economic Community was to take place over a 34-year period to end in 2028. But in 1999, African leaders decided to shorten the process and accelerate the speedy establishment of the Abuja Treaty or the African Economic Community. Then we had the OAU going away and being replaced by the African Union in 2002. Incidentally, the African Union also referred to the Constitutive Act establishing the African Union, also referred to the African Economic Community. And so it's a build-up towards the final formation of the AFTA. And it said, among others, in the preamble to the CA, that's the Constitutive Act, that the AU was established in conformity with the ultimate objectives of the Charter of our Continental Organization and the treaty establishing the African Economic Community. So the AU was finally born in 2002, and unlike the OAU, it had copious references to human rights and issues regarding human security. Therefore, conditions were set right to inject a human rights dose into a future trade agreement. Alongside the AU came NEPAD, the New Economic Partnership of Africa's Development. And for the first time, Africans admitted that the problem was not just external, but also internal. So I quote, it says, post-colonial Africa inherited weak states and dysfunctional economies, which were further aggravated by poor leadership, corruption, and bad governance in many countries. These two factors, together with the division caused by the Cold War, hampered the development of accountable governments across the continent. So having recognized that we need to balance the equation and balance the prognosis to Africa's dire economic circumstances, one would have expected that human rights will lay the foundation for Africa's future growth and economic policies. However, and then also we realized that we have the Agenda 2063, which the AFTA also builds on. And the Agenda 2063 talks about the Africa we want, and it's a 50-year strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent. Most often, we refer to the Agenda 1, that Aspiration 1 of the agenda, which calls for a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, and link it to AFTA. But there's also Aspiration 3, which calls for an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Yet, as will be unfolded, the AFTA that we have doesn't seem to have taken the Aspiration 3 very much into account. So, in 2018, the AU agreed to establish AFTA, as well as the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to free movement of persons, right of residence, and right of establishment. These two documents were crucial to establish the continental free trade framework. Now, having set up this background work, I now ask my three questions, or I come to examine the three questions. First of all, how is AFTA framed to promote trade, to promote the benefits that it's touted that they will be realized? That is, AFTA seeks to realize the benefits through, one, promoting economic integration of the continent, coordinating and harmonizing policies among existing and future economic communities, promoting trade liberalization and ultimately establishing a common market, and also the gradual removal of obstacles to the free movement of persons, goods and services and capital, and the right of residence and establishment. Definitely we see a human rights element in here with regard to free movement, residence and establishment, but that is certainly not enough. In any case, they only apply to foreigners or Africans moving from other parts of Africa into a country, but it doesn't apply to citizens of that country. A human rights framework that will lay the foundation for economic growth and development. Of course, there is this tension that we can attain development without human rights, looking at the example of China and some other Asian, so-called Asian tigers. But there are other factors that are responsible for the kind of development they have attained. And so the bottom line is that we cannot run away from the fact that human rights are pivotal to development. And we can look at this from two angles, as procedural rights and as substantive rights. Procedural rights, we can talk about right of access to information, right to participation broadly in terms of decision making and taking part in implementation of the decisions. Right of association, the ability to form any form of association, including setting up businesses, and my colleague talked about the limitation placed in the way of parties bringing disputes before the dispute settlement mechanism, which relates to the question of association and whether and to what extent it's been recognized, as well as right of access to justice or the right to effective remedies where there are violations. And so these rights are critical to be able to ensure that what we call the rights to be, the rights that will lay the foundation, will be established. And these procedural rights will also help to curb issues such as corruption, as well as, for example, environmental impact assessment issues, which are not very much implanted and recognized within the actual documents. So these procedural rights are supposed to empower people, to provide agency to them, to challenge governmental excesses and to contribute to decision making and promote participation. And ultimately when you enjoy your rights to be, and you're able to lay the foundation for your future development, you enjoy your rights to do. That is where you take part in activities that will promote your well-being. Then you acquire property and you enjoy your right to have. And so these rights are critical. And where there are also violations, these same procedural rights will enable one to go to court to demand access to justice. Enjoying these rights will lay the foundation for development and for economic growth as well, which ultimately will tend to development. And then we'll be able to enjoy some substantive rights in the context of economic, social, and cultural rights. Right to life, right to education, right to health, and so on. But then also, still in the context of procedural rights, you can talk about the fact that these substantive rights can extend to unlawful interference in the privacy of the family, freedom from discrimination, and even the right to life. Having said that, the AFTA document, through a careful review, indicates that of the 33 references to rights in the document, just like the LPA, it has only one connection to human rights, and that is in the preamble. And so it tells of a deficit here in terms of how rights are to be promoted. Of the remaining 32 references to rights, they refer to rights of states. And as, again, Professor Bocha has already said, the document is state-centric. So there's little or not enough attention to labor rights, rights of minorities, women, child labor, the environment, and so on. And I've already referred to the private parties' inability to go to dispute settlement or not. And while there are certain rights, there is the introduction of clawback clauses. Clawback clauses are given with one right, given with one hand, and taking it back with the other hand. So we have situations where some rights are recognized, such as, for example, in the preamble, it refers to gender rights. But these rights are taken back by the fact that the enormous provisions on rights given to states are able to be cloud or tramp on these rights that have been given to individuals within the AFTA document. But the point that needs to be made is that to enable human rights to be a benefit to free trade, human rights need to be inserted and mainstreamed into the free trade project right from the beginning to drive the much touted benefits to be realized. That is, human rights should define the mandate of development, or development should be defined in terms of human rights language. So promoting human rights will be a means of its own as well as an end. And it should remind us that placing too much reliance on conventional economic measurements of economy-wide potential gains arising from liberalization can overshadow adverse distributional impacts. And when we're talking about the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, Residents, and Establishments, interestingly, we have a situation where 32 countries have signed the Free Movement Protocol, but only 4 have ratified. And we need 15 countries before that protocol can come into effect. So in that respect, we have a deficit as well. Impacts in terms of the benefits. Various sources talk about the benefits to be derived from AFTA, and it's all there for us to see. A market of 1.2 billion Africans with a combined GDP of 2.5 trillion, increase in African trade by up to 52.3%, welfare gains estimated around 2.64% of continental GDP, which is roughly 65 billion in the terms of 2018 when AFTA came into place. Increase in real wages for unskilled and skilled workers, export diversification, sustained growth, expansion of the size of Africa's economy by to 29 trillion US dollars by 2050. However, human rights is not mentioned as one of the benefits. That when AFTA is implemented, is going to promote human rights for everybody to enjoy, or at least to some extent. It is argued that these benefits can also be converted or be seen within the prism of rights. And this argument is made by even the World Bank, the UNDP, and others that seek to incorporate human rights terminology into classical development discourse. In other words, all development assistance are seen to contribute to economic and social rights. Thus, for example, if agricultural projects, whatever their nature, are claimed to contribute directly to the fulfillment of the right to food because it is connected to agriculture. But that is a very weak argument to make. It is more or less a provision of needs instead of provision of rights. And there's a big difference between the two, because with rights, the people are involved in enjoying the rights to promote their development, and then they enjoy these developments in the context of rights, and they also have the guarantee that these rights can be protected as well, in terms of going to court or challenging governmental attempts to intrude on the enjoyment of these rights. Or maybe African states had in mind, the framers had in mind, that they are still going by the old rhythm, that development, human rights is a byproduct of development. So the benefits are set as differently, and when the benefits are realized, then human rights will naturally appear as a byproduct of development. We don't know if that argument is sustainable, because we can say that we have been waiting for this since the time of independence, the late 50s and early 60s. Second aspect of the impact, the harm. A free trade agreement should anticipate the impact, that is the harm part, on the rights of the vulnerable especially, and those who are likely to be left behind by such a project. AFTA will impact different socioeconomic groups differently. And I quote a UNDP statement, ironically, because on the one hand, they see development as human rights and no difference between the two. But it's a very important statement they make here. Trade agreements invariably affect the human rights of consumers, residents, workers, those in poverty and others, and on the ability of states to regulate and protect the human rights of their people. However, trade agreements are often negotiated without reference to their impact on the rights to health, education, food, work, and water, according to the UNDP and then a joint report with Human Rights Office. So, who are those who will be impacted negatively or are likely to be impacted negatively, and whose rights will in that context be affected? And therefore, there's a need to take that into account in the, at least in the other documents or protocols that AFTA is going to come up with. Informal cross-border traders are among those who will be affected. Incidentally, 43% of Africa's population eke out income through informal trading activities, and a good number of them across borders. But most often their acts are considered illegal, especially if they cross borders. And that will be a problem or a challenge for AFTA to deal with. There is going to be competitive pressure from large agribusinesses in high-income African countries, which may cause small farmers to lose their jobs. So job losses are likely to take place. Of course, AFTA is going to increase or open up opportunities for jobs, but the most vulnerable may likely lose their jobs. And it's also been mentioned that the bigger countries will benefit more from AFTA before the smaller countries will also come upstream. So small and local and medium-scale enterprises are going to be choked. Some may choke out of existence because of cheaper goods that are going to be produced and sold by foreign suppliers. There will be adverse working conditions, and the environment is likely to be degraded. We already have references from the FDIs that African countries have gone into, creating free zones and so on, where multinational corporations have a field day as to how they treat the environment and they treat labor and so on. There is also the likelihood of increase in transnational organized crime. As a result of opening of borders, as a result of reduction and elimination of tariffs, and the fact that it's going to increase interconnected that cut across borders. We have examples such as drugs, talk about 419 activities, talk about human trafficking, and so on. The records show in all free trade agreement areas such as NAFTA and others. And that situation is going to rise up here. But transnational organized crime thrives best where corruption is high. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So in that context, there's also the record, Africa's poor record in terms of how we protect the rights of indigenous peoples. And AFTA is going to lead to land grabbing. Already land grabbing is ongoing. And some estimates indicate that so far some multinational corporations, the land that they have grabbed in Africa after the fall of the Berlin Wall can cover the whole of the country of Kenya put together. So that is huge. And it's likely to continue under AFTA. So investors already have poor records with regard to their human rights obligations. And they have been spurred on by the fact that African leaders themselves don't respect our rights generally. So multinational corporations have managed to bulldoze their way through negotiations. They have been granted generous tax concessions and unfettered access to natural resources or markets in the global south, while they pay grotesquely low levels of royalties to its citizens and destroy the environment. So, but the UN has come up with some principles on business and human rights. The Ruggie principles, which are 3, and I'll mention them quickly. First, states' obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the state is an obligation imposed on the states as well as on businesses. So 2, businesses are supposed to comply with applicable laws in the state and to respect human rights. 3, the need for rights and obligations to be matched to appropriate and effective remedies when there is a breach. But the records don't look too good. Even when we look at the 2022 Agenda 2063 records, it doesn't look too good. If you look at the Mo Ibrahim index, it's also not very good. There's been a dip in the fortunes of Africa in the area of integration, not integration, but security, rule of law, human rights, and related fields. In trying to bring my presentation to a close, I want to make the case that there's a need to ensure that we deal with the issue of corruption, which has strong relations with human rights, as well as with the transnational organized crime I mentioned. When we talk about transnational organized crime, you can see it in 3 contexts. First, as a core, or in other words, it can stand on its own. That is where an activity can be undertaken and it will bring profit to that illicit activity. It can also be a facilitator. In other words, one transnational organized crime activity facilitates the performance of another. For example, money laundering, corruption. It helps in, for example, human trafficking and galamsey and so on. Then it can also be an obstructor. It obstructs justice. When the palms of judges are greased, it leads to corruption taking place and leads to transnational organized crime blossoming because the perpetrators are able to have their way. When you look at the case of corruption, it falls into all these 3 areas. And corruption thrives where human rights are not respected. Corruption is controlled where we have access to information or the procedural rights I mentioned. Freedom of expression, press freedom, access to justice, freedom of assembly, and so on. And when corruption is controlled in that way, then we can enjoy the substantive rights, such as the economic, social, and cultural rights I mentioned. And if that is not the case, then the result is poverty production. Sometimes we talk about poverty reduction, but the other side can be equally true. So, in summary or in closing, I'll make the point that for the AFTA to be successful, it must be consistent with the economic justice and human rights values that are embodied in the Sustainable Development Agenda that Africa has set for itself. And here I'm talking about the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Agenda 2063, especially Aspiration 3. We're also talking about other international human rights treaties that African states are parties to. Then we also need to decolonize our political system. The political system reflects the repressive character of colonial laws. We have a situation where just this year, in April, Human Rights Watch's Human Rights Report on Africa indicates that human rights violations continued in 26 African countries that the watchdog monitored, with the situation worsening in most of them. Then last year, Democracy Index indicated that Africa recorded more than 50% of 50% of African countries were recorded authoritarian rule, and only 2 were considered as full democracies of the 55 countries. The rest are hybrid regimes and flawed democracies. Certainly, this cannot lay a solid foundation for the operationalization of AFTA, because the human rights foundation is weak, the democracy foundation is weak. And as I mentioned, the Mo Ibrahim Index also talks about decline in the quality of security, rule of law, and corruption. And so the conclusion is that we need to pay attention to at least a minimum standard of respect for human rights, rule of law, and democracy in Africa as the foundation, as a basis. It is very easy to be a part of the African Union. It's very easy to be part of AFTA because all that you need to prove or to establish the fact that it's an African state. But when you're talking about the European system, for example, human rights, democracy, the basic standard needs to be met before you are allowed to become a member of the European Union and other European arrangements and free trade agreements. That is critical. And so without that, it means that we are going to have a challenge with implementation of AFTA. With respect to AFTA protocols, some have already been negotiated and some are already in place. But I think that still we can inject some human rights mechanisms and structures into that. The others that are ongoing, states parties should emphasize the link between AFTA and human rights, between corruption, as well as the rule of law. And I also propose that there should be a separate protocol on human rights and sustainable development as one of the future protocols that AFTA should deal with. Otherwise, we're going to have a repetition of the 60s and 70s, because already we see elements of that. In the past, African states didn't want to leave office, so they became vice presidents and so on. Today, the records are not very good. Many countries are refusing, have situations where governments are refusing to leave office after losing elections. And when cases go to the courts to be resolved, most cases they lose. It's only in 2 countries in Africa, Malawi and Kenya, where they have successfully challenged election results in the courts. About 15 or 16 African countries have introduced third termism, which allows for a third term or indefinite terms in office. There is lack of reference to human rights in the economic development programs, such as the Lagos Plan of Action and AFTA, which I already mentioned. So the similarities are there. And if the similarities are there, it means that we may record the same similarities with regard to the results. And therefore, it is important that the human rights element is taken serious attention to and made to reflect in the AFTA that we all deserve, so that we can have the Africa that we want, which Agenda 2063 talks about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Another excellent presentation. Another round of applause for Prof, please. Thank you. 2 brilliant presentations. And now we're going to open this for Q&A. And yesterday we forgot to bring virtual listeners on board, and we hope, Mr. Letta, we have an opportunity to do that today. So what we'll do, we'll take 5 questions posed at both our speakers, and they will respond, and we'll go for a second or third batch. We'll see how things wind up. And then we'll bring in our virtual listeners, their questions also. So when you want to ask your question, you say who you are and where you're coming from, and so we can progress now. 5 questions. First one here. Yes. Have the mic. I think we might as well just.
Yeah. Okay. Emeritus Prof, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Philemon Ochodankwa with Investor Merchant Bank. So my question goes to Professor Abuchi. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Very 2 quick questions from my end. The first one, I refer to the AFTA Protocol, Part 4, Article 4, Subsection 2. Just to paraphrase that, what it speaks to is that nothing in this protocol stops state parties from entering into preferential agreement with third party. My question is that to what extent legally can state parties be controlled to respect these protocols so that we can protect the sanctity of this AFTA agreement? Because where there is subjectivity, if you're not careful, then you miss the point. And lastly, you made a fantastic point around various challenges. There's a school of thought that says that allow the protocols to proceed based upon the phases, then iterate as and when you go along. Or the fundamental challenge is change it now, because it can literally cost you as you go along in execution of the AFTA agreement. So I just want to check you respectfully, where do you stand? Do we need to now pause, change some of these challenges before we proceed, or do we necessarily move on and make some iterations as when we go along? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Emmanuel Bensa. I work with AFTA Policy Network. This evening I'm here with my colleague Audrey Rani, who works with the Women of Africa Network. So for those who are interested in how women should be empowered around the African Continental Free Trade Area, they may be interested in having a word with her. I think the panelists spoke to the fact that there are a lot of young people here, and it's something that we at the organization have been very concerned about. That at the end of the day, whatever we do, it is these people young people who are going to see the fruits of the work around the African Continental Free Trade Area. Therefore, the sensitization is very key. I think both of you spoke to something which is very important on the freedom of movement. I think the ECA came out with a report just a few days ago in which it spoke to one of the challenges around freedom of movement, the human rights, and it referred to it as a human rights challenge, because there's still a lot of corruption, as you will know, around the borders, Sahel, West Africa, typically, and a lot of people are still being denied entry, even though it's a visa-free regime that exists in West Africa. These are the young people who are going to be part of that narrative in the next 20, 30 years. There's a lot of conversations around migrants, okay, where we see that distorted narratives where we are being told that a lot of Africans are going outside the continent to see greener pastures. Whereas the actual narrative is that a lot of Africans prefer to stay on the continent and actually go to a lot of African countries. Uganda is one of the countries where there are a lot of African refugees, for example, because it has a very important regimes. Now, the freedom of movement, one of the things that I foresee a challenge is that here we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat in Accra. Yet Ghana itself has neither signed nor ratified the Freedom of Movement Protocol. I think one of you spoke to the fact that the 32 member states had signed it back in 2018. Only 4 have ratified. How is it possible that we just have 4 countries that are ratified, yet we have 15 member states that do visa regime in West Africa? We have about 6 that do visa regime in East Africa very well. So that's already 21 countries that do visa-free regimes very, very strongly in their own regions. And yet we are going to deny the right of establishment, the right of entry, the right to do business for these young people in the next 20 years because our own Ghana has neither signed nor ratified. What do we need to do to make sure that Ghana gets its act together to sign and ratify the Freedom of Movement Protocol? It was compelled to do so back in 1979 for ECOWAS. What does it need to do to make sure it does it for the Continental Free Trade Area? Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more here.
Good evening. I'm Justice Kweko Akabwa I'm from the judiciary. Thank you, Professor Abochi and Professor PJ Chia. I think my question is regards to the human rights provisions. I mean, based on the historical trajectory that you laid out, one can say that the AFTA has taken a bit of a step. The step being that now you made mention of the preamble that has a human right provision on gender. And I see that I think that clause E of Article 3 also has a gender provision, and Article 27 of the Protocol on Trade for Service also make mention of gender equality. We know that the AFTA is the market. So it is the state parties that are supposed to domesticate laws to promote, to encompass these protocols and to promote all of these provisions. The question is, from your search, has Ghana as a state party taken steps, for example, to domesticate these provisions on gender equality? Because to my mind, if one has to look at where we've come from as a continent, I think there is a reason for making sure that there's some gender provisions in this AFTA, i.e. to help women development and to promote women equality. But these protocols, the market is now in place. Has any nation at all taken steps to promote, make laws to promote these rights for women? Thank you.
One more. That's it. But there's one at the back.
Thank you very much. So the question is from one of our professors online. So if you permit me, can I read it?
Yes, go ahead.
So this from Professor Samuel Dateba. He said, what role do the panelists see for the Convention of the International Sales of Goods in the AFTA?
Can you repeat that, please?
What role do the panelists see for the Convention of International Sales of Goods in the AFTA?
Thank you. So can the speakers tackle? Thank you. So I need the speakers to address their respective questions, please.
Okay, so, my Lord, thank you for your question. There are 2 points to it. One is the fact that we have human rights, a number of protocols and treaty, 2 main treaties on human rights, one on the human and people's rights, and then the one on the African Charter on the rights and well-being of the African child. And then a number of protocols for women, disability, and others that's attached to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So we have made some progress in that respect. When the African Charter came into being, it was ridiculed because there were a number of gaps in there. But in the course of time, they have made up for these gaps by the introduction of not only protocols, but also resolutions and declarations that seek to expand on the meanings of and application of these human rights norms. So it's a positive in that respect. However, one thing we need to note is that the two are not connected. The development agenda reflected in the AFTA has been separated from the human rights provisions that we have on the continent. For example, I don't see why AFTA should not reference the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and say that this is a document that we built after on this document, because that is what the Constitutive Act refers to, and it's also reflected in the Agenda 2063. But why AFTA decided to separate itself from that is a bit of a puzzle to me. Yeah, and then secondly, we have a situation where parties may not be able to refer matters to the dispute settlement process. Yeah, and the dispute settlement process doesn't also have reference to human rights. And I think that it should be there. Of course, we are talking about trade, and trade is the dominant point here. But in my opinion, within the African context, human rights should certainly be reflected. And when you look at the record of ratification of human rights treaties, especially the African versions, there's a number of, the record is good for African countries. But in terms of implementation, that is where we are lacking. And I think that that in itself reflects the fact that we need to do more to lay the foundation right so that we can adopt a human rights based approach to promote the well-being of the citizenry and in promoting trade and ultimately development. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm honored to know my Lord was listening. So yes, perhaps I should have spoken a bit better, knowing that he was actually listening. So my Lord, I think I would reiterate what my colleague said, Prof. Etua, by simply adding that because it's a convention to which members or African members of the AFCFTA may already belong, the reciprocal obligations created under the convention applies between the parties. Of course, in the event of a dispute brought before the DSB under the AFTA, primarily a party may not come before the DSB, and the basic complaints is probably essentially all founded on the CISG, because the AFCFTA, as an agreement, the rules of the AFCFTA have primacy. But because the parties may be parties to other international treaties such as the CISG, where that is invoked as a sub-complaint in terms of reciprocal obligation between the parties which has been breached in respect of a dispute which has been brought before the AFTA as a sub-component, I'm not sure the DSB would entirely refuse to make pronouncement on that. Of course, there will still be constraints because they would not see themselves primarily as an arbitral body charged with the mandate of interpreting those other treaties. Nonetheless, my humble opinion on this is that because the reciprocal obligations that are created under those treaties equally bind, such as, in this case, the character of contracts, delivery of goods, obligation between buyers and sellers, and this is also a trading regime. I can see a lot of point of intersections where complaints under the AFTA may also be implicated under other cognate agreements such as the CISG. So I foresee the possibility of this happening, and when this is invoked before the DSB, I'm not quite sure that they will want to wash their hands entirely of it. I'm sure they'll probably want to go ahead and still proffer opinions on the portions of those other conventions that are implicated under ongoing disputes. Respectfully, that's my thinking. Shall we go ahead with the other?
Yes.
So the other questions, I think the first question was on the preferential provision. Here's what I think. I think it's a bit bizarre, if you ask me, that the AFCFTA agreement actually expressly gave the option to parties to go ahead and sign out of that and give other parties, and it's not even limited to Africa, it says other third parties. It is a bit bizarre because what it does is that it dilutes its own advantages. It means the African countries can create the same benefits with third parties outside of the AFCFTA. But when people are making promises that apparently hurt them, very often look carefully and you will realize that they are making concessions to lure. So here we are, we had countries refusing to sign the AFCFTA even when it was negotiated. You can imagine the obstacles along the negotiating process. My opinion is that that provision is one of the concessions, one of the trade-offs, basically just telling African countries that, look, you're not entering into an agreement that will block you off entirely from other third-party rights and options. Mind you, the AFCFTA, as you see, is actually a reflection of a lot of bargaining and negotiating tensions and third-party interests outside of Africa, some of whom have deep pockets and were, in a very soft and subtle way, threatening African countries not to even sign. And so all these were designed to ensure that the various cacophony of interests were taken account of, and therefore countries were assured that this is not going to entirely block you off. So it seems a bit bizarre, but that appears to be some of the subterranean reasons. The other one is you're asking whether to modify or to allow it to evolve. when there are problems, some of the problems that are identified or we identified. I think the two options can be used in combination. And you rightly said, yes, some agreements allow evolution, so that evolution will lead to all kinds of new protocols here and there. But some too may go ahead with amendment. My preference is that given the nature of this after arrangement, I think it seems more, my thinking is an immediate amendment or change may actually be preferable, even though I have to be honest, that is not likely to happen because of how difficult it is to actually get these amendments done. And the reason for that for me is simply because you really want to create an effective regime from day one. And the accidental evolution and sometimes the costs surrounding that, you can't afford that. I don't expect to see African countries withdrawing from the AFTA arrangement, but one possibility is that you may have an agreement or an arrangement which is really not as patronized as you will expect, and that people are, or countries are resorting to other markets because other countries are offering all kinds of incentives in the background. You probably don't want that. But the two can happen, or one can happen as against the other. My preference, if one should happen, will be immediate change. Freedom of movement. I lamented over that, and I still lament over that in a manner that I find quite disturbing. The reason is because there are changes that are difficult to make when you have to intervene. And there are changes that are less difficult to make when you have to simply remove. For example, if we have to intervene to dismantle certain barriers or borders, put in place certain institutions, these may require actual investment of money, and sometimes states will say there's no money. But when you simply have to stop something, such as in this case, basically just saying, from now on, you can travel from all the countries of Africa. You can travel in all the countries of Africa. All you need is a passport of an African country. So that's all. And so we don't even need to make new passports. That's how it is. Because what I know is being contemplated now is to have an African passport. But that one is an intervention. And that could be a little expensive sometimes, a bit more, a bit more problematic because of all kinds of things you need to put in place to create the new passports. But the easier one is to say anybody who holds an African country's passport. That's it. And so all you need to do is to hold a country of Africa's passport. And every country in Africa already has passports. So we don't need to do anything. In that case, it simply means from now on, if I'm traveling to one part of Africa, I don't have to go to any embassy. Imagine a businessman who has 10 companies across 10 African countries. What it means is that if there is no reciprocal visa waiver regime between the two countries, the countries involved, he has to worry about 10 embassies and visas anytime he has to go around. That is, and of course, not talk about financial rights. So these are problematic. I think the free movement one, my thinking is, and that's the suggestion I make, my thinking is if the AFCFC Secretariat even signs up or starts a voluntary system that says all the countries who think that they want to sign up to this system of, we'll just make a declaration. From tomorrow, our citizens can visit without, they should just bring their passports. And we'll see the countries that will sign up. I have the belief that many countries will sign up. Countries are just wondering how to go about it, but I'm sure many will sign up. Some will not, because some benefit from the visa fees. But once they see their colleagues sign up, and they see the economies of scale being enjoyed by the businesses of those countries, they will just take it up. I mean, they'll basically just join that. As I indicated, I just came from another country in West Africa that says there's no visa requirement. But we had to pay tourism fee, which is even more than the visa fee that people pay in some places. So smart ways of still collecting the visa fee, which will still be problematic, but at least you are assured of one thing. You are assured of the fact that there's no interview, there's no possibility of being denied a visa. You have the automatic option of entering in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, so let me add a point or two on the issue about movement, freedom of movement. I think that what we can do, as was the question was, is that we engage civil society to also make sure that we make it known. There's a lot of people who don't even know about the fact that there is such a protocol that needs to be signed. So if people get to know about it, we build a coalition around it, I think we can make the government move in that direction, especially considering that the Secretariat is here. Fortunately, we also have the Deputy Minister here, so I'm sure he will send the message across and we'll get some results. Yeah, and with regard to the flexibility in making agreement with third parties, it reminds me of the arrangements, on the side arrangements that the US government made with countries that signed up to the, became parties to the International Criminal Court. Ghana, for example, was made to sign an agreement that it would not surrender US citizens to the courts. That certainly dilutes the implementation mechanisms that the ICC is supposed to realize. And so this one is similar, also similar to the flexibilities arrangement in the TRIPS agreements, which also allows for developing countries to have some flexibilities, but still developed countries have signed agreements with a number of these developing countries, which makes nonsense of the flexibilities that they are supposed to enjoy under TRIPS. So it is certainly a weakness in the after document, but as Professor Abochi said, it's a way of allowing more countries to come on board. And that is where the problem really lies, because if you recall, West Africa wanted to introduce the ECO currency, but France quickly rounded up Africans, Francophone countries together and introduced the same name to the currency they want to introduce. ECOWAS is there, but you have UEMOA and other similar organizations that France has been able to bring the Francophone countries together to also set up, which in a way rival ECOWAS or some of these other institutions. So we will need to make sure that African states recognize that this is the time, this is our time to really shake off these colonial linkages and appendages and make sure that we really come together so that we can achieve the goals in NAFTA in that context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did one of you look at the sensitization of the youth? Can you specifically address one of the questions, sensitizing their youth? Yes. Can one of you address that? Yes.
Okay, well, that's a good question. And I started my presentation by saying the AFCFTA's success actually depends on the youth. And the reason it does is because it's people-centric, even though the agreement appears to make it state-centric. And the reason it's people-centric is because the people who do business are not government. Government provides the space. And the minister can see is nodding, but that's exactly what it is. Government provides the space. So it is being people-centric. It is one that young people must be aware of. The government has just introduced a program, Youth Start, which is designed to ensure youth entrepreneurial tendencies. And the reason is because the people who go on the streets to demonstrate for lack of jobs and unemployment are young people. Every year, the universities are turning out tens of thousands of graduates. And the index between jobs, available jobs, and graduates, people who are graduating from the universities, it's really spiraling out of control. The reality is there are no jobs out there, and the universities also are part of the problem. We are training all kinds of people for jobs that are not existent. So the truth of the matter is the AFCFTA represents a huge opportunity waiting. But I've always said, it also represents a looming danger. Now the looming danger part is the one I worry about. And Honorable Minister, probably this is where your ministry may want to start some sensitization program. I'm sure there is one, perhaps I'm not aware of it, but a sensitization program for the looming danger part, for people to be careful and ready. And the reason we have to be careful and ready is, once we sign up to the 90% categories of goods that are supposed to be tariff exempt, what it means is that immediately we have opened ourselves up to the African competition. Whether we produce or not, others will produce. And if others produce and we don't produce, then we become recipients. And if we become recipients without the opportunity of competing in return, then it simply means the little we have now, others are going to take away. That is where the danger is. In other words, there are businesses we see around now. If we are not careful, in the next 10, 15 years from now, they won't be around. And the reason they may not be around, maybe because of the after. Because for now, they enjoy competitive advantage because of the tariffs. Because we have existing tariffs, the businesses that are in Ghana, they don't pay tariffs. They are doing business in Ghana. The ones that are coming from abroad will have to pay tariffs at the ports. So by the time they come and put the margin on the tariff margin on whatever product they're selling, the Ghanaian one is supposed to then have a competitive advantage because it doesn't have tariff. Now, once they remove the tariff requirement, those businesses will then have the opportunity of coming to Ghana and compete with us at the same competitive level in terms of sale. Many of them may have been produced at a cheaper level because of cheaper credit from where they are coming from, because of cheaper electricity, who knows. So the long and short is we have to be ready to go into other people's markets, same way they are going to come here. So that if we lose some businesses here, we would have offset it or made up for it by our competition elsewhere. It's important, therefore, that young people begin the entrepreneurial battle cry because something is going to happen. Now we are still not seeing it because after it's still what, 2, 3, 4 years, it's still very young. But as you give yourself 10 to 15 years from now, the real impact of after is going to hit. And we can't blame government. Because the truth of the matter, as I indicated, is government can only provide a space. After it's about the competitors, the businesses. But that's where we need the sensitization and the facilitation. And perhaps that's where the minister comes in. I'm very happy the minister is here to hear things directly because he obviously has a decision-making authority. So I do hope that answers the question of sensitization. It's very important. I don't think we are doing that much at this stage. And that's why I can't be happier seeing a lot, young people here, because it really speaks one volume. And that is the people who are actually going to be affected within the next 10, 15 years. They're the ones who are here. In the next 5, 6 years, many of them would have graduated from the universities, and then they would have been taken off and really taken over the country. And so that's why so sensitization is crucial, and I'm glad the question was raised.
Thank you very much. We'll do another round of questions, and then I think so. Any from?
Yes, please. We have one more from online. It says, how would our markets, women and men down there get the information about AFTA and more preferably understand this concept in order for them to contribute their quota to the sustainability? How would our markets, women and men get this information in order for them to contribute to their quota?
Okay, good.
Second,
let's get the group and then, yes, the second. Is there a second online? Okay.
The absence of the possibility of individuals assessing the dispute resolution mechanism of the treaty detracts them from its utility and could lead to the absence of support for the treaty eventually from a popular perspective. Without popular support, the treaty may not yield the results intended for it by the founders. Economics cannot thrive without people. Kindly comment. This question is directed to both eminent presenters. This is from Prof. Albert Fiajo.
Albert, sorry, from Prof.
This is from Albert Fiajo.
Okay. Thank you. The question, please repeat it again.
Okay, it says,
slowly.
The absence of the possibility of individuals assessing the dispute resolution mechanism of the treaty detracts them from its utility and could lead to the absence of support from the treaty eventually from a popular perspective. Without popular support, the treaty may not yield the results intended for it by its founders. Economies may not thrive without people. Kindly comment. This question is directed to both eminent presenters.
Thank you. Now we need to hear from our students. Students, you must have some questions. Yes, there's one over there. In fact, two.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please, my question, I'm Calvin Jomiku from Prusec. My question is, Prof talked about bureaucracy, a situation where the businessman will have to go to the government for him to get dispute resolved between him in country A with a businessman in country B. I want to know, if I am doing a business with someone who the government doesn't know about, and now I'm introducing the government in dispute, won't that affect my profit margin? Because the dispute is already affecting my business, and I have to introduce government in this, which will take a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And question number 2.
No. Please let someone else ask. There was a hand up.
Thank you for this privilege. I wanted to ask, I personally know African Union as a socio-political bloc, and they have introduced AFTA. So AFTA is more concerned about the economic situation of countries. So I wanted to ask, is AFTA AU's way of having influence on the economies of countries to the extent that it will get to a point where, because they have much influence in their economies, they can impose sanctions on them when it gets to a point where they have to introduce something and the African countries decide against it? Like, citing an example, in the European Union, it started as a socio-political bloc, but now it has gotten to a stage where when they bring out something and an European nation or a member of the EU decides against it, they can impose sanctions on them and block their economic resources. So I was asking that, can that happen to countries or member states of AFTA? Thank you.
Thank you. Good. I think we answered this, and then the day will be fast spent. So our speakers, please.
Thank you, Prof. Chair. So how do you get the message to the market women? I think it goes for everyone pretty much. And I would just like to then take the opportunity of tying this in with Prof's question, Prof. Yajo's question. Prof was my teacher, so I'm not sure why he was calling me an eminent speaker. He was my teacher. It's humbling to know Prof is listening. I think I 100% agree. And in my presentation earlier, that's why I drew attention to how the old paradigm appears to have been African state, African government relating to African state, African government. A lot of champagne diplomacy, beyond that, very little much to show for it. It seems to me that some lessons are being learned in that respect. And part of that lesson is there's a recognition now that we have to move from the state to the sub-state. And the sub-state is the people, the institutions, the companies, the entities, the ones that are actually doing the legwork. It seems to me that the AFCFTA recognizes that. And events post the adoption of the agreement all testifies to that. The kinds of meetings that are going on, the kinds of gatherings that are going on, the kinds of conferences, the kinds of meetings between business entities, the kinds of facilitations, the kinds of institutions, including Afreximbank, including finance houses across the continent. You can tell that there's a recognition, and perhaps the experience of other regions of the world are around handy for us to learn from. So the EU, for example, and other places in the world. So I 100% agree with Prof that in the absence of popular support, we can pretty much just be talking to ourselves without going anywhere. I think that popular support is important because this agreement is about people. This agreement is about businesses. It's about companies. This agreement ultimately is about the sub-state. It's about the micro, not the macro. And so I think in that respect, at the moment, it seems to me there's some traction. We are moving on a certain traction. One of the key agreements that had just been adopted, or rather a key mechanism or instrument that has been adopted is this PAPS, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which deals with the issue of the payment in local currencies to avoid the difficulties of the dollar. And, I'm not sure how many of you know, but Africa loses an estimated amount of $5 billion every year in exchange losses, just exchange losses. And so we all somehow have to convert into that dollar. And that dollar, which is not an African currency, but somehow it is the only one our countries respect and recognize, but our own currencies, nobody recognizes them. The PAPs represent, again, a fundamental achievement already for the AFCFTA, and it shows how there's a recognition that we have to move from the state level to the boat or not and get things done. But the popular support is critical. How do we get the popular support? How do we get that actualized? I think that partly ties in with the question that was asked about the market woman or the market women, but pretty much everyone. We have to popularize the AFCFTA. And popularizing the AFCFTA means we need to vernacularize the AFCFTA, for example. And I haven't seen that. I haven't seen much of that. Vernacularization of the AFCFTA. The reality is the people who speak English and French and the big official languages on our continent in proportional terms are really not as many as those who don't. And the people who do businesses, sometimes we equate English with equivalent with smartness, but the reality is probably not. There are a lot of people who are doing big business who can't speak much of this language, but they're able to do things. I think we need to vernacularize it, and by vernacularizing it, we'll get the average person attached. I don't think that part we are doing that yet. Some things have been done right, but perhaps when it comes to the issue of popularization, we're not doing as much. The GAAS can really be commended for this initiative, particularly of bringing young students here. You know, not even university students, not even, the people who are out there already, who are already out there, but people who are the real face of the AFCFTA. Because my opinion is the AFCFTA will truly take off, at full throttle, perhaps in the next 10 years. It's still gathering speed, but perhaps in the next 10 years. And the ones we see here are the ones who are, at that time, likely to be the movers and shakers of things. The state-centric, there was a question about state-centric, but was it your question? Yes. I mean, the explanation I gave earlier, I don't know whether I can give a better explanation, but unfortunately, that is what it is. And I think it's one of the weaknesses. Namely, government would have to be the medium through which you channel your complaint. I think that's one of the weaknesses. And that goes back again to your question, whether we should change or we should allow evolution to happen. That particular example, evolution is too costly. In other words, we have to wait. And the reason for this is, look, in Africa, there are complications. And the complications include the fact that in some countries, if your party is not in power, the government in power is not even interested in your business. Unfortunately, we have politicized everything, including business. So for some reason, even businesses, they will tell you this one is there and that one is here. And so imagine that in terms of perception, a particular business person is deemed to belong to a certain political party, and his party is not in power. And he has a major trade complaint against a business partner in another African country. He has to go through the government, for the government to go and fight on his behalf. For a continent where politics is so toxic and keen, we can imagine how problematic that could be and how that can undermine commercial interest across the continent. I think that one may be in need of some change. Government can pursue it if the individual wants to use government, but the individual should be able to bring an official complaint before the AFCFTA. And if they are worried about unnecessary complaints being brought, they can put in place a sifting mechanism, where if you bring a complaint, there can be an initial assessment of whether a complaint is legitimate and serious enough, and then it goes to step 2. But the idea that you go through your government or forget it is problematic.
Yeah, that is certainly problematic, and it brings to mind the fact that in the context of international law, the state is not obliged to take up matters on behalf of the citizenry. It is required as a right of the state to do that, but it's not a duty. And so making it, making the state obligated to do that will be a problem. Now, there was a question about sanctions. Yes. There are already, of course, the AU, as you said, was socio-political in context, just like the ECOWAS. But it didn't take long for economic considerations to also feature. So like I said, the African Economic Community started years back, and out of which has evolved for us to have the AFTA today. And so, and we also have the Regional Economic communities that are also recognized by the AU, even before the AU came into place. As for sanctions, they have already been there. They are already there. The AU imposes sanctions on various matters. So you don't need to have economic systems in place before you can apply sanctions. For example, if a government comes to power through unconstitutional means, the AU can impose sanctions. And right now, ECOWAS has issues with Mali, Guinea, and another country because of unconstitutional changes in government. So the sanction regime is already there. And what the after sanction regimes are bringing will be different. It will be related purely to the trade relations that will come up. So the sanction regimes are already there, and whether they are working effectively or not is another thing, but they are there already. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think because of time, I have to bring this question and answer to a close. And we've had a rich, the lectures and the rich discourse. I think it's been fantastic. But as chair, I'm forced to tell you a couple of take-home messages that I took from the two. From Prof. Abuchi's political and legal environments for the AFTAG. We have this new dynamism which is called for us to have a change. And looking at the major policy agenda of 63, and we see he says AFTFCA is a game changer. In fact, is the new magical wand that we see will bring in renewed energy, bring in single markets, removing tariffs and bringing the untapped potential. But we need the potential of AFTFTA is to put together the bolts and nuts and then the various components, address the problems that we see, and that will get us where we want to go. These are political hurdles, remove the colonial barriers, which are still inherent in our political systems. And there are legal implications, and we need to actively build capacity in individual countries and address the complex legal and political economic issues in the various countries, because we cannot move forward without doing that. The AFTFCA Secretariat should recognize and build capacity, indicative units he mentioned, of building capacities of the various components that we need to move on. Basically, we need to popularize his last words, one of the last words. What we need is to popularize AFTSC, vernacularize it, and make it, buy the populace buy into AFTSC so that they can understand it. And then from Prof. Piaget Atua, the human rights implications of AFTFCA. The most important thing, again, he said, is decolonize our political system. So I think both of them mentioned that. We need a human rights framework. Human rights is pivotal for our development. I think you've heard it all, so these are the two take-home messages. And I thank them for a very rich evening. Can we give them another round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chair, for those closing remarks. And with that, we have come to the end of this evening's session, day 2 of our 3-day public forum. Tomorrow will be the 3rd and final day. We will have another session here in the auditorium at 5:30 p.m. on the sub-theme, Infrastructure and Intra-African Trade. It promises to be another very exciting and educative session.